Hello, I'm Nick, and this is Today in Philosophy of History for Friday, 3 May 2024. It is the 555th anniversary of the birth of Niccolò Machiavelli, who was born in Florence on this date in 1469. In a recent episode on Francesco Petrarca, I discussed the question of Petrarch's modernity in the 14th century. Machiavelli comes more than a century after Petrarch, and we could say that he is among the first modern men, just as well as we could say that Petrarch was. So what is it that makes someone modern? Edith Hamilton, in her book, The Greek Way, wrote this of Euripides, quote, "There is an order of mind which is perpetually modern. All those possessed of it are akin, no matter how great the lapse of time that separates them," unquote. And then further along, just a few paragraphs later, quote, "The modern minds in each generation are the critics who preserve us from a petrifying world, who will not leave us to walk undisturbed in the ways of our fathers. The established order is always wrong to them, but there is criticism and criticism. Cynical criticism is totally opposed to the temper of the modern mind," unquote. Many people take Machiavelli to be both modern and cynical, which Hamilton seems to declare is impossible. And not everyone necessarily takes Machiavelli to be a cynic. I wouldn't necessarily call him that, but given his reputation for amoral politics, it is inevitable that people would call him cynical. Machiavelli is frequently called modern, but the modernity that is ascribed to him can take different forms in different contexts. For some people, it's what I just mentioned, his amoral approach to politics. And this does seem to be something new in history in his time. Nietzsche called himself the first immoralist in the 19th century, but Machiavelli, I think, probably has a better title to being the first immoralist. But it had long been a tradition in political thought to instruct rulers in piety and virtue. Machiavelli was among the first to say the quiet part out loud, that rulers should appear to be pious and virtuous, but actually to be pious and virtuous is probably ruinous, so that princes must learn not to be good. And that was shocking in his time. Machiavelli's notorious book, The Prince, with its advice for rulers not to be good, was in a sense radically new, but there are other ways that it was quite traditional. Machiavelli was offering moral advice to princes, unconventional moral advice certainly, but still it was moral advice. And in so doing, Machiavelli had produced his own entry in a familiar medieval genre of literature, which were books that were called Mirrors for Princes or Speculum Regnum. Unconventional moral advice is, after all, still moral advice. Machiavelli's Mirror for Princes, though, was a modern mirror, a medieval genre which had been transformed by Machiavelli for a newly modern world. And nothing was going to be the same again after Machiavelli's kind of moral advice. It was his break with the presuppositions of traditional modernity that made Machiavelli modern in many eyes. But Machiavelli could also offer more traditional moral advice, as in this from Machiavelli's Discourses on Livy, quote, "Great men are always the same in every fortune, and if it varies, now by exalting them, now by crushing them, they do not vary, but always keep their spirit firm and joined with their mode of life, so that one easily knows for each that fortune does not have power over them. Weak men govern themselves otherwise, because they grow vain and intoxicated in good fortune by attributing all the good that they have to the virtue they have never known. Hence it arises that they become unendurable and hateful to all those whom they have around them. On that depends the sudden variation of fate. As they see it in the face, they fall suddenly into the other defect and become cowardly and abject. It arises from this, that in adversities princes so made think more of fleeing than of defending themselves, as those who are unprepared for any defense because they have used good fortune badly, unquote. This is shrewd and accurate as a moral observation. Notice that Machiavelli concludes this passage with the idea of weak men using fortune badly. Again, Machiavelli understands the world in amoral terms, but moral forces are still present in that world, and a person has to take that into account in their political action. Machiavelli also understands the world in terms of human agency. Human beings have the power to influence and affect their circumstances, and even to change the world, you could say. Men may be strong or weak, courageous or cowardly, but they have the agency not exactly to control fortune, but to use it well or to use it badly. So man is in control of his own destiny, but this control isn't absolute and it isn't without limits. And this is a naturalistic and rationalistic conception of human destiny based on empirical observations. And it would be accurate to call this a modern point of view. There are no signs and wonders in Machiavelli, as we find in so many other writers. And the only thing he accounts for in his politics and his history are the actual behaviors of actual men. This moral modernity also reveals itself in Machiavelli's philosophical approach to political life, which was also naturalistic, empirical, and scientific. James Burnham, in his book, The Machiavellians, Defenders of Freedom, argued that Machiavelli was applying the methods of science to political thought. Quote, Machiavelli's method is the method of science applied to politics. Machiavelli uses language in a cognitive, scientific manner. That is, except where he is frankly urging his readers to action, he uses words not in order to express his emotions or attitudes, but in such a way that their meaning can be tested, can be understood in terms of the real world. We always know what he is talking about. This, a requirement for all scientific discourse, is in political and social discussion an achievement of the very first rank, unquote. So this scientific approach to philosophical thought also shows Machiavelli in a modern light. We could even make the argument that Machiavelli's amoral perspective on politics follows from his scientific conception of political thought, because an objective and value-free political science would, of necessity, be amoral. As with Machiavelli's moral advice, Machiavelli's naturalistic conception of history was by turns both medieval and modern. Burnham's book has a section on Machiavelli's conception of history, which discusses Machiavelli's emphasis on the role of fortune in human events. While this isn't exclusively a medieval theme, the Rota Fortunae, or Wheel of Fortune, was one of the great symbols of the Middle Ages, making an appearance at the beginning of the Middle Ages in Boethius's The Consolation of Philosophy, from which, quote, "This is my art, this the game I never cease to play. I turn the wheel that spins. I delight to see the high come down and the low ascend. Mount up if thou wilt, but only on condition that thou wilt not think it a hardship to come down when the rules of my game require it," unquote. That was Boethius on the Wheel of Fortune. We can say then that, like Petrarch, Machiavelli was both modern and medieval. And following Hans Blumenberg, that the Machiavellian moment is one of the great moments that oscillate indecisively between epochs, which is something I previously quoted in the episode on Petrarch. Machiavelli's conception of the role of fortune in human life and history is expressed in very different terms than that of the Rota Fortunae, however. In chapter 25 of The Prince, titled "What Fortune Can Effect in Human Affairs and How to Withstand Her," Machiavelli says that fortune is a woman. Quote, fortune being changeful and mankind steadfast in their way, so long as the two are in agreement, men are successful, but unsuccessful when they fall out. For my part, I consider it better to be adventurous than cautious, because fortune is a woman, and if you wish to keep her under, it is necessary to beat and ill-use her, and it is seen that she allows herself to be mastered by the adventurous rather than by those who go on the work more coldly. She is therefore always womanlike, a lover of young men because they are less cautious, more violent, and with more audacity to command her, unquote. And earlier in the same chapter 25, Machiavelli writes of fortune, quote, I compare her to one of those raging rivers, which in flood overflows the plains, sweeping away trees and buildings, bearing away the soil from place to place. Everything flies before it, all yield to its violence without being able in any way to understand it. And yet, through its nature, though its nature be such, it does not follow, therefore, that men, whether the weather becomes fair, shall not make provision, both with defenses and barriers, in such a manner that, rising again, the waters may pass away by canal, and therefore be neither so unrestrained nor so dangerous. So it happens with fortune, who shows her power where valor has not prepared to resist her, and thither she turns her forces where she knows that barriers and defenses could not have been raised to constrain her, unquote. Machiavelli then implicitly invokes the ancient image of time as a river that can rage out of control and sweep away everything in its path, but also a river that can be controlled when the appropriate measures are taken. If time is a river, history too is a river, or maybe history is the entire watershed of a river, floodplain and all, a canyon shaped by the continuous passage of time over the ages, carving its bed into the rock, leaving layers of sediment in the wake of a storm, and amenable to control, but only, as with human destiny I mentioned earlier, within limits and not absolutely. We see these features of history that seem permanent to us, but if we had seen each moment of time as it passed, we would know how it all came to be. But Machiavelli is an optimist, you could say, or if not an optimist, at the very least, he believes in the possibility of human agency. A raging river can sweep everything before it, but human beings can make provision for the raging of the river, knowing that sooner or later there will be a storm or a flood. Machiavelli himself witnessed some of the storms and floods of history firsthand, and I suspect that the events he witnessed shaped his understanding of the world and resulted in the political philosophy that he wrote for us. In 1494, when Machiavelli was a young man, the French marched through Italy on their way to Naples for Charles VIII to intervene in the Neapolitan succession. France has always been the most centralized of the European powers, and throughout the Middle Ages, it was the most populous country in Europe, so that made it the superpower of its time. As the massive French force marched through Tuscany, they took several cities, although the ultimate goal of the expedition was Naples. Florence attempted to remain neutral, but this wasn't good enough for Charles VIII. Machiavelli was 25 when the French marched into Florence, and he probably never forgot the experience. Piero de' Medici, who came to be known as Piero the Unfortunate, capitulated to the French and was run out of Florence for doing so. And it's an interesting footnote to history that Piero the Unfortunate was assisted in his flight from Florence to Venice by the great French historian Philippe de Comines, who is called the first truly modern writer by Saint Beuve. So here we have yet another late medieval writer like Petrarch and Machiavelli, who has been understood as being already a modern man. Florence was wealthy and influential and a great center of arts and culture, but it could not defend itself against the French. And the French disaster was followed by the rule of Savonarola, which was a further humiliation for the proud Florentines to sustain. And Machiavelli's The Prince ends with an exhortation to liberate Italian from the barbarians, as he puts it. Quote, at the present time, in order to discover the virtue of an Italian spirit, it was necessary that Italy should be reduced to the extremity she is now in, that she should be more enslaved than the Hebrews, more oppressed than the Persians, more scattered than the Athenians, without head, without order, beaten, despoiled, torn, overrun, and to have endured every kind of desolation, unquote. At the very end of the book, Machiavelli closes the book with a quote from Petrarch. Virtue will seize arms against frenzy, and the battle will be brief, for ancient valor is not yet dead in Italian hearts. James Burnham, in The Machiavellians, which I mentioned earlier, emphasizes the part of the rationality of Machiavelli's thought lies not only in his scientific methodology, but also in his concrete non-utopian goal, which was the liberation of Italy from foreign forces and the ultimate political unification of the Italian peninsula, something that didn't happen for hundreds of years until after Machiavelli died. The political milieu that Machiavelli experienced in his time, and which inspired The Prince, has been mirrored many times in history. And several hundred years after Machiavelli's time, Johann Gottlieb Fichte found himself in a situation parallel to that of Machiavelli. Fichte's country was occupied and controlled by foreign forces. Germany at this time was not yet unified into a single German nation state, as indeed Italy was not unified in Machiavelli's time and was still not unified into a single state in Fichte's time. Both for Fichte and Machiavelli, it was the French who were the great threat. Napoleon's forces swept across the Germans of the early 19th century, much as Charles VIII's forces had swept over the Italians at the end of the 15th century. Those who saw the capitulation and humiliation of their homeland were marked by the experience, and they never forgot it. And Fichte wrote an essay on Machiavelli as an author and passages from his writings, which has been recently translated by Ian Alexander Moore and Christopher Turner. This is among the first of the appreciations of Machiavelli that was not openly hostile to his thought. All throughout, after Machiavelli wrote, throughout the 17th and 18th century, he was viewed as kind of like a devil incarnate who was willing to say terrible things that no one else would say, and everyone wrote a pamphlet against Machiavelli because that was the way to show that that was the early modern method of virtue signaling, to write an anti-Machiavelli pamphlet. Fichte marks the beginning of a change in that, because Fichte saw in Machiavelli a starting point for his own political reflections. Quote, Machiavelli has been dead for almost 3 centuries, and that in my editions I have preceded in accordance with his principles and have only supplemented him as he himself would have been able to do 3 centuries ago if he had occasionally been willing to dig still deeper into the matter, but mostly if he had not sought to limit himself so strictly to the nature of his fatherland at the time, and instead extended his considerations to the lands that he knew well and that had a more established civil constitution, unquote. Fichte's essay on Machiavelli was read by none other than Karl von Clausewitz, who wrote a letter to Fichte about this essay on Machiavelli. And Clausewitz wrote in this letter, quote, I believe that, unlike Machiavelli, we should not cling to methods that were successful in the past, reviving them in one form or another, but rather seek to restore the true spirit of war. We should begin not with the form, but with the spirit, and wait confidently for it to destroy the old forms and to create better ones, unquote. Clausewitz's criticism of Machiavelli is not that Machiavelli was too radical, but that Machiavelli was too traditional. Fichte also implies that Machiavelli was too traditional in this limitation of the scope of his inquiry. So both Fichte and Clausewitz found in Machiavelli an important source from which they could draw, but still one that was limited by the time and place of its incarnation, you could say. Peter Parrott, who's one of the great Clausewitz scholars of our time, wrote a paper titled Machiavelli, Fichte and Clausewitz in the Labyrinth of German Idealism, in which he argues that Fichte and Clausewitz had very different conceptions of history. We could add to this that Machiavelli's conception of history differs both from that of Fichte and Clausewitz, but that Machiavelli was relevant to both, despite their differences, shows the ongoing influence of Machiavelli in historical thought. So happy birthday, Niccolò Machiavelli, and thanks for listening.